This is the process shot. I'm Michael. I'm stuck in a haunted movie theater, and I've seen my best friend's Exorcism, a new horror film from director Damon that wants to be a horror comedy, but, well, I'll get to that in a bit. Anyways, it follows best friends Abby and Gretchen, who, with some others, hang out at a lake house for a weekend, getting roped into taking some drugs and eventually exploring the area, more specifically a haunted house. In this house, they end up encountering something that's either a bad trip or something supernatural. Either way, it leaves Gretchen shocked, sullen, and almost a completely different person, pushing Abby to wonder if something traumatic happened. It turns out it's demonic possession, but for a while they set it up as being something possibly more serious. That is partially where the movie stumbles, in my opinion. It tries to be a horror comedy most of all, with a tongue-in-cheek treatment of its 1980s high school setting, and the many pop culture references and name drops within, coupled with two normal teenage girls having to contend with demonic possession on top of their own social problems. When it has that in mind, it manages to pull off the irony and contrast pretty well, though it does lean more into making references as a joke, if that makes sense, as if the idea or imagery alone were the punchline. Whatever the case, the movie does go into the other end of the emotional spectrum and reaches for more dramatic, oftentimes darker topics, most of all as Abby tries to help Gretchen through whatever she's going through, and sees hostility from others for her actions. It actually brings the movie out of horror and more into tragedy as Abby sees her own social life collapsing while others ignore or mock her. Not to mention how the audience is made unsure if something paranormal is actually going on at all. It certainly adds to the tension of the whole story, but there's still an issue in the greater tonal whiplash that occurs when it decides to pop right back into the comedic aspects without any warning or segue. 1 minute, one character is facing a personal crisis, the next minute another character is being a wacky parody. It truly does break you out of the experience, not so much out of disbelief, but more out of confusion, trying to figure out how one scene is supposed to lead into the next. I suppose it doesn't matter too much, since the horror elements eventually come back into play, though it just means the dramatic scenes now have scary stuff in them while the comedy parts continue to mess things up. As for the rest of the production, things are still pretty mixed, partially because of the dueling tones and mostly because of whatever comes up in film production, I guess. There's some iffy moments in the acting, at least in the beginning. Possibly because, for whatever reason, there are several scenes where the filmmakers seem to have dubbed in dialogue in post-production. It just seems unnecessary, or at least rushed, especially with how fakey and forced it sounds. Anyways, the other technical elements of the movie aren't too bad, given how messy the rest of it can get. Cinematography and editing generally stay more practical, with a few creative parts here and there when it comes to the horror scenes and jump scares, but otherwise not trying anything more stylized or creative. Speaking of style, there are a few areas where color is given some attention, though even then I can't say it's anything significant, and not just to differentiate the muted and downbeat events Abby is going through from the more saturated world around her. I'd say it's more in lighting we get some of the better visual elements, but even then that's still limited to horror scenes where they'd actually think to pay attention to stuff like that. I would even say the same thing about special effects, especially since it's the horror scenes where they show up almost exclusively. The soundtrack is probably the best thing out of every other element at play, though only when the original score is considered. The rest is pretty much a playlist of 80s songs, since again, this is a movie set in the 80s and they have to remind you of that. Come to think of it, they don't even do all that much to remind you about it after the initial setup. This story probably could have taken place in any decade. Either way, the final film really is a mixed bag, with good and bad elements all over the place, resulting in a movie that's just as scattered in its structure and especially in its tone, trying almost too hard to have things both ways. My Best Friend's Exorcism, Damon Thomas, 2022. 2 stars. I wouldn't really recommend seeing it. That's it for this review. If you liked it, leave a like. If you didn't, leave a comment. Subscribe to the channel for more reviews. By the way, I think there's a plot hole. The girl who gets possessed was wearing a cross when it happened, so that should have kept the demon at bay, right? Or is that not actually how it works at all?